Who were those people guilty of those crimes? Those who became members of this repression system, persecuting the forgotten soldiers and their families. Mr. Płużański, a journalist, is with us tonight, a distinguished journalist, writer. He is now head of one of the departments in Super Express Daily in Poland. Mr. Płużański is a distinguished scholar and with an expert on forgotten soldiers, and he co-authored, or actually authored, he's the author of the book entitled The Beasts, which brings the stories of those people guilty of repressions in the Stalinist times, but not only then. Over to you. Good evening, everyone. Professor Wolsche has already made an introduction to this subject matter. This system of repression in the communist times in Poland was aimed at the destruction of the Polish nation. That was a well-functioning system of crime. The secret police, in many of its forms, but also the judiciary, justices, prosecutors, but also executioners. The name Śmietański was mentioned here, but also Alexander Drey was one of the executioners guilty of killing our heroes using the so-called Soviet method by putting a bullet inside of in someone's brain, shooting them in the back. Many of those methods that you kindly described, Professor, was actually the fate of my father in this horrible, hallowed place and in Warsaw, run by the Polish secret police. Allow me to tell you some stories of those who were the part of the repression system. In 1990, Czesław Łapiński wrote to my father, and I quote, "Professor, it is my wish to meet you to talk about those trying times, about this tragic time, the process that we participated in. Our meeting, I believe, may contribute to a common assessment of this process which led to the death of Commander Pilecki." My father did not dignify this letter with a reply, as he was dealing with a prosecutor who prosecuted Commander Pilecki, but also wanted to send my father 6 feet under, which never materialized, fortunately. But there were no grounds for any sort of a discussion, because clearly there are two camps. On the one side, executioners, including Mr. Łapiński, and on the other hand, on the other side, the heroes and those accused, but also Commander Pilecki, Mr. Łapiński. Truth to be told, on the occasion that we met, as I had the doubtful pleasure of running the investigative journalist effort in this particular case, he always wanted me to pass on his greetings to my father. Those meetings were difficult. Let me just boil it down to a conclusion. Tragic one on the one hand and optimistic, rather upbeat on the other. When I met Mr. Łapiński, I always wanted to know what was the background, what were his reasons that led him to murdering people. At one point, I simply put a question to him: why did you do it? And that was his only truthful reply, an honest-to-God reply. I had a wife and children, and I had to bring home the bacon. And this is where I reached my breaking point. And I said very clearly to press this message home: do you realize, I said, that Commander Pilecki, whom we personally executed, also had a family, a wife and children, and he had a will to live. The difference, however, between you and him was that he wanted to live in a free Poland and not occupied by the Soviets. He would not agree to the role which was offered to him, that is a Soviet narc. Czesław Łapiński passed away in 1992 in Warsaw. He was never sentenced in a court of law, even though attempts were made by the Polish Institute of Remembrance, National Remembrance. Now, what were the circumstances that would allow us to bring a case against him? Not because he was actually an executioner. The actual reason for the possible court proceeding was that he actually made some formal, he behaved negligently. Those beasts were actually the same sort of situation. There are obviously some lacunas in the Polish legal system, unfortunately. Perhaps it is our job to make sure that necessary changes are made to the Polish legal system. Mr. Łapiński faced only one setback, that is the death of Commander Pilecki in a hospital.
Pani Helena Wolińska-Brus, Stalinowska.
There are other cases. Ms. Mróz, a Stalinist prosecutor, was never persecuted, as she was the engine behind the persecution of General Fieldorf. She could have been brought to justice eventually, because she bestowed her sentences belatedly. Stefan Michnik is another case in point. He was a military Stalinist justice. A Polish journalist, Pospieszalski, actually approached Mr. Michnik. He was living in Sweden at the time. A door was opened and one question was actually put to Mr. Michnik. How do you assess your past? Was the question. Mr. Michnik said, quite honestly, that it is his business what his past was. Obviously, he has the right to share his mind on the subject, but there needs to be the Polish state behind all this to make sure that he's prosecuted, because actually back then he was representing a Polish state and he was actually murdering our heroes. Another case in point was the Warsaw Łączka. The actually Warsaw Meadows, as many of Michnik's victims are buried there actually, and this is one of the quagmires that we are still faced with. You kindly mentioned Mr. Moczarski, Kazimierz Moczarski, and he was interrogated by Mr. Himczak in Warsaw, in the headquarters of the secret Polish police. This gentleman was brutal not only to the Commander Pilecki but also to my father. I received information that this murderer, torturer, is being buried at one of the Warsaw cemeteries. I actually went there and had the doubtful pleasure of talking to his wife. I'll ask her a very brief and direct question. Do you realize what your husband did after the war? And Ms. Stanisława Himczak answered, she said, if you're asking a question like that, it means that you must be a son of a criminal. And this, we dealt them quite rigidly after the war. And she actually worked for one of the ministries, actually the Ministry of the Public Security, the Communist ministry after the war. And this is just one of the few cases where one of those torturers actually faced justice. The so-called dirty dozen was actually put on the bench in the court that was actually tried. Those were actual criminals, and they received sentences, it is true, but it was actually a bogus trial, a staged trial, because the then communist Poland wanted to demonstrate that the Stalin's times were behind. Some of the torturers never faced justice. Commander Pilecki and my father were called criminals by those people. The conclusions, I'll leave it to you. Obviously, they were the criminals, not our fathers. Another case in point, if I may, Chairman. There were many criminals of this sort. Richard Moniko is still alive. He was deputy head of one of the Warsaw prisons. He's still alive in the town of Hrubieszów. He's alive and kicking, and going on cycling tours. He was very happy, and he was thanking Mr. Lech Wałęsa for putting some money in his pocket in terms of the indexation of his pension allowance. Now, when we got down to brass tacks, he didn't remember anything. Ostensibly, he didn't want to reveal any places where those people had been buried, out there in the meadow, even though he was clearly in the business of burying people. And I demand that Mr. Mońka is brought to justice, because he was a communist criminal, obviously enough. And for one particular case, especially, that he participated in person, in the flesh, in the execution of Commander Pilecki. This is how they actually walked to the old boiler room. The only shot was actually fired at this place. Śmietański was fired this shot, but also Alexander Drade fired a round, and he would usually do it drunk to oblivion, and he actually passed away in the 90s. Śmietański before that time, but some other people are still alive. I actually put an application to the National Remembrance Institute for those people to be prosecuted. Now, I actually was given a response that Mr. Mońko never played any significant role in the Pilecki case, and this is how your justice system in Poland is actually functioning. What we hear is that those people are too old to be put on trial, as there is a legal category missing, as it is actually the case in Germany, that those people should be put on trial for aiding and abetting of this crime, of the execution on Commander Pilecki. But sadly, this is not actually the case. Now, one of the biggest problems we're faced in modern Poland are the legal ramifications that I already touched upon, as we actually recognize the legality of the former communist Poland. Well, what follows is that legal ramifications back then were actually legal as well, and must be recognized. Now, if you get into the nitty-gritty of things, then it may turn out that Mr. Pilecki were put on trial legally. So this shot in the back of the head was actually an expression of legal justice. And now we may put on trial of those murderers only because there was some negligence in terms of putting into practice of some regulations. This is something which actually fly in the face of reason. I can hardly comprehend those ramifications. We cannot, I demand, recognize the communist system. We need to go back all the way to the pre-war Poland and the legal system therein. And finally, the final case in point is the so-called Warsaw Medal. Unfortunately, exhumations have not been completed. 3 years ago, someone put a stop on the proceedings. I think someone actually made an effort to block it. The Łączka Medal Foundation, which I actually had, we are hoping that this is going to change. Yet another point that I wish to make on the legal ramifications we are dealing with. Now, if we approach the victims buried in this meadow using the legal system at hand, those people ostensibly remain criminals, as the sentences imposed on them are still in force. That also covers the case of Captain Pilecki. Those people, including Captain Pilecki, are still considered by many criminals and fascists. I hope that this is going to change, and I'd like to thank you sincerely for allowing me to participate in this debate.